So it seems to be 1 o'clock and we have a large group attending on Zoom, and that's great. Very welcome to everybody, and of course a special welcome to Miriam, who is going to deliver the lecture of today. I am Samuel Rubinson, and I'm Senior Professor of Eastern Christian Studies at St. Ignatius, and also Professor of Church History at Lund University. And it's my privilege today to introduce our lecturer. I've known Miriam since she was an undergraduate student in Uppsala and then Jerusalem, and I've had the great privilege of following her work and being impressed by it, I also must admit. Miriam holds a PhD in Semitic languages from Uppsala University. Her thesis on the Arabic translation of the Book of Daniel was published by Brill with the title Christian Arabic Versions of Daniel 2016. After finishing her doctorate, she spent some years as a researcher in Munich in the large German-Israeli research program on the Bible in Arabic before joining St. Ignatius as lecturer. She is currently pursuing a research project on the reception, use, and interpretations of biblical texts in the Christian Arabic tradition, including various understandings of the process of canonization. At Stockholm School of Theology and St. Ignatius, she is also teaching courses within biblical studies, as well as history of religion and in Orthodox tradition in general, and especially the reception and use of the Bible. I must say Miriam is very special because she belongs to a rather limited but extremely important group of scholars who have intimate knowledge of the languages, historical circumstances, and cultural exchanges necessary to investigate the complex process of the various translations of the Bible into Arabic, including the early Islamic movement and its various interactions with Jewish and Christian traditions and literary forms. We are very pleased to have Miriam among us at St. Ignatius, and I'm very happy to give her the floor right now. Please, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That was,
I should add, of course, that if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll then put the questions after the lecture. So if you have any questions, use the chat and I will then give the word to those who have questions. Sorry, please, Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And also thank you so much, all of you who come here to listen today. I'll try to share my screen. Okay, so today I want to discuss with you, not my own research, but I want to discuss how I envision an education in biblical studies within the field of Eastern Christian studies. But what I'm presenting is not something specifically connected to Eastern Christianity, but it relates to this ongoing discussions what subdisciplines the field of biblical studies should contain in 2020, when we have much more complicated understanding of texts and the process of meaning making than we had a generation ago. At St. Ignatius, we have, I think, a unique opportunity and a unique competence to deal with new aspects of biblical studies. So I'm very excited to be part of forming such an education, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your thoughts on this after my presentation, and maybe you can share your own experience in the field. So now in this presentation, I'll take as a point of departure not only what texts mean, but what texts are. And I read from the slide here. Texts are complicated in the sense that they are more than the intentions of their authors, yet subjugated to the anticipations and prejudices of the readers. And in the same time, they can enable a meeting with the other that challenges the reader to reevaluate their prejudice or give the ones they have a deeper meaning. Because of this complexity of texts, biblical studies should, in my opinion, be evenly divided over these three areas here: reception history, hermeneutics, and biblical criticism. In reality, of course, these three areas overlap, and that's an argument in itself as to why all these three areas need to be seriously considered, not just mentioned. Everyone mentions them, of course, but that's not the same thing as taking them equally seriously. So with biblical criticism, I basically mean historical and literary critical studies which try to reach back to some sort of original context of a text to find the supposed original meaning, trying to figure out, for example, what Paul actually meant as opposed to what we think he meant, or how the church later developed or improved his thought. And with reception history, we are basically doing the same thing. We use the same methods. We're trying to find out how something was understood in a specific context. Now, the problem with reception history is that there are so many histories out there. The Western department, it's of course natural to cover Western history. But here at St. Ignatius, I think we have this unique competence because we can together cover unpublished Ethiopic, Arabic, Syriac, and Coptic material in a way few institutions can. But it's not enough just describing what we see. We also need to be able to analyze what we see in these sources. And that's why I think the last category is so important. I call it hermeneutics here, but I'm thinking, what I'm thinking of includes more abstract theories in general. And hermeneutics is often explained as the art of understanding understanding. And here is also where we try to understand the relation between texts and reader in its larger context, which in our case often is a church tradition. And more importantly, here is where we try to understand how human beings function. And the biblical material is very good to use as the corpus for doing that, because it's so vastly used over time. So this was the first introduction, the brief introduction, and now I'll discuss more particular aspects of these three areas and give some examples. And my goal is basically to show you why I think these aspects are interesting and how these three areas are anyhow interrelated. In many biblical studies departments today, it goes without saying that the primary focus in a biblical studies education is historical and literary criticism, meaning which are primarily focused on the text in its presumed original context. And reception history is therefore sometimes referred to as biblical studies on holiday. This probably meant originally that it's something you do when you're not doing your real work, and your real work is teaching biblical Hebrew or the historical Jesus class. So reception is something you do on your free time. But Susan Gillingham, who is a scholar in reception history, she points out that this is actually an excellent metaphor, because it's often on our holidays that we go to visit new places and gain new perspectives. And so we learn to see things differently, and we return home with new energy and new insights. Because by traveling, we expand our knowledge of the world and our place within it. And that's a very important aspect of reception. Reception history is basically traveling through time. Now, if there's something that the historical and literary schools have taught us, It is that reception is part of the development of the Bible itself, right? The first thing you often learn in the biblical studies course is that there is this Pentateuch, which itself is made up of several sources, of which some comments on the others. And then we have the prophets and many of the writings, which often refer back to this law and complain that the law is not followed, which of course is interpretation and reception of the law. And the Gospels then interpret the Hebrew Bible so that it fits its meta-narrative that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So the reception of the Hebrew Bible in the Gospels is essential for the identity of the Gospels. And then Paul and the other epistles aim at adapting what they see as the message of the gospel event. So in one way, it's very unnatural not to continue this process of reception that was already set in motion in the biblical texts themselves. Or put it differently, reception and adaptation to new contexts are aspects of the essence of the biblical texts themselves. Now, before we go back to the biblical texts, let's turn for a short moment to hermeneutics. It is a philosophical field which tries to understand why we understand things the way we do. It doesn't ask what did Paul actually think. Instead, it asks, why do you think Paul thought this or that? So hermeneutics moves the focus away from the Bible as an historical object, and instead it focuses on the interpreting subject, which is you and me. And it basically means that you interpret things the way you do because you're part of a particular context with a particular tradition, which has a particular history, and you interpret an object so that it suits your personal and communal experience. And Michael Satlow, who is another biblical scholar, he notes, and I quote, "There is no reading outside of history in our larger conceptual apparatus. That is, we cannot escape the well-known hermeneutical circle and psychological tendencies to try to reinforce that apparatus rather than challenge it." So what Satlow says here is that we are psychologically disposed in a way that our brains will choose for us to reinforce our presuppositions and prejudices instead of challenging them. And this is, of course, very, very problematic insight, because it means that we don't want to be challenged or changed. We just want to continue believing what we already believe. But this observation doesn't mean that we are slaves to our natural reactions, right? We can overcome this because we can, at least to a certain extent, be critical to our own hermeneutical circle. And human beings have this incredible capability to move beyond themselves. And this is something that often happens in relations with other human beings, but also in relations with texts. We can be changed by text written 2,000 years ago and challenged by it. And what I find absolutely fascinating with the Hebrew Bible is that texts within it are in dialogue or even in contradiction with one another, which means that what was praxis in one situation might be challenged in another situation. And I'll give you a few cases where relation is in focus. And I guess my overall point here, besides me really liking these examples, is that relation with the other is often what causes change or challenge. So if you read the Hebrew Bible closely, we can see that these texts are struggling with a couple of questions. Let's call them eternal questions, in the sense that they can't really be solved by a single yes or no answer. And one such question in the Hebrew Bible is the treatment of non-Israelis or non-Israelites. The main idea is that Israel is different and separated from other people. And also there's this feeling that other people cannot really be trusted. So for instance, we have this example from Deuteronomy 23, where we read, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt." So the message is simple: don't mix with Moabites, because they did not give you bread when you needed it. It was a bad relation. And this is a commandment of God here. I mean, it's from the law, so you're expected to follow it. But let's go to the book of Ruth. What is the book of Ruth? What is it all about? Well, it's about the Moabite who gives bread to Israelites, right? Is it just a coincidence that the story of Ruth, the Moabite, is about bread? It starts with a famine. There is no bread. And then Ruth is picking wheat to make bread. It's a very essential part of the story. And it's apparently against the commandment given in Deuteronomy, or at least it tries to abolish the cause for the ban. Now, Moabites don't give bread. That's the point in Deuteronomy. But if we have a Moabite who does give bread, what do we do with her? So not only is Ruth allowed to coexist with the Israelites, she's even made the grandma of King David. So she's sort of incorporated into the holy genealogy. And it's most likely a reality behind this story. Some says it's a reaction to Ezra's cruel divorce laws. But in any event, it's clearly about friendship with the other, with someone who is not part of the own group. Now, the word root comes from re'uth, probably, which means, of course, friendship. So Ruth is friendship with the other, and it's a beautiful story about accepting the other into the self, even against legal praxis. And it's also an example of a biblical scholar. In this case, this was from Introd Fisher, who works on literary criticism. And to write this article, she used later reception. She used rabbinic midrash technique to understand and argue for processes going on already within the biblical corpus. And that's why she argues that Ruth is this interpretation on Deuteronomy. Now, another example Fisher brings up of where biblical texts are in dialogue with one another, again concerning relations, is found in Genesis. Now, if we read here from Genesis 3, it says, and it's the woman who's being addressed, "Your desire, chukah, will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." So this is, of course, this is God's curse on Eve. And the plot, as we all know, is set in paradise. It's set in a beautiful garden. And the main characters are a man and a woman. And through disobedience, their relationship is destroyed. And the punishment is the woman's chukah, the woman's desire, will be for the man, and he will rule over her. Now, the word chukah is a so-called rare word. It only occurs in the Genesis context here, and then it occurs one other time, and that is in Song of Songs. And what is Song of Songs? Well, the plot is, again, it's set in paradise, in a beautiful garden, like in Genesis. And the main characters are a man and a woman, just like in Genesis. But here comes the difference. The setting is not disobedience, as in Genesis, but love, their love for each other. And what happens then with the curse? Well, if we read here from Song 7, the woman says, "I belong to my beloved," which is fine. This is also what we read in the end of Genesis, and he will rule over you, sort of. But then she says, "But his desire, his chukah, is for me, the woman." So the curse is seemingly repelled. It's seemingly, again, against the curse given by God in Genesis or rather, I think what they're doing is that they're negotiating in a way that the relationship is restored. The woman's desire is still for the man, but likewise, the man's desire is for the woman. So they're equal because of love. And this is a fascinating little discovery, at least I think so, which was only detectable by a close philological study of the Hebrew source text. And this connection between these two passages get lost often in translations. At least in the latest Swedish translations, you're using two different words in Swedish for this one word in Hebrew. So the parallel, they did not see the parallel, and sort of the parallel also got lost in translations. Now, the last example I want to give, of course, it's the most challenging in terms of relation. It's well known. It's Jonah, and Jonah doesn't want to bother with the Ninevites because they're not his people. And this book is very much about whether Israel's God is only for the Israelites or if the Israelite religion is universal. And of course, this is something Christianity then picks up and develops fully. The Israelite religion is then definitely for all people in Christianity. But we can speak of an eternal message here if you want to, of the book of Jonah. Then I would say it's about this presumption that your responsibility is only towards the own group. That's the eternal question. Or at least I would say that this is the question from my perspective. But apparently some Assyrian Christians today, I have heard, take this passage very literally, and they associate themselves with the Ninevites, because Assyrians, I mean, the capital of the Assyrian kingdom was Nineveh. So to them, this story is about how their specific people were inserted into God's plan. And I very much like that interpretation. And it also makes Jonah a very, very important prophet for them because of that. And the fact is that you can interpret biblical narratives in many different ways. The fact that we all read the Bible in so many different ways is a proof that it seldom provides one answer to complex questions, but that it allows for tension and multiple meanings. And especially by preserving such gaps, paradoxes, errors, the Hebrew Bible invites you as the active interpreter into its realm. And this is exactly what reception history thrives on. It's especially gaps and paradoxes in biblical text that motivate interpreters to actively make choices. And when they're doing these choices, it's often where they reveal their meta-narrative or presumptions or cultural values. Because when we read a passage which is easy to understand, we read quite passively. But when we come to a passage which is difficult to understand, we make a stop and we have to make a choice. Do we continue trying at all? And if we continue trying, then we're starting to engage with the texts in a more active way. And for that reason, I like very much to look at problematic biblical passages. And a classic is, of course, ELISHA and the Bears. It's a very short story, just a couple of sentences inserted into the Bible quite randomly, so it gives us very little context. And the basic idea, as you probably remember, it's that there are these young boys who make fun of Elisha because he's bold, and Elisha curses them, and out come bears and kill the kids. There are many gaps in this story that will be filled by us in order for us to make sense of it. And one common interpretation is, of course, that don't question the authority of God, because then you currently deserve to die. And given the larger narrative where God drowns the Egyptians in the sea, This interpretation is quite sound. I mean, it makes sense. It's probably why it was inserted there, to show that the prophet was a man of God and had his authority. But many people would find this passage slightly problematic today. Maybe they have kids and they know that this is of things kids do, especially under group pressures. And one student told me, maybe Elisha was shocked by what his curse could do. We don't really know that from the story. It's too short. And maybe the point of this story then could be interpreted as a warning for misusing religious authority. And when people start bending the text around like this, it's often because we think that about the practical implications of interpretations. And now we're moving into one of, I think, reception history's most important contributions. Because besides trying to describe and understand how an interpretation is made, reception history can also move from the interpreting subject to the effect a reading has on society, on other human beings. And because reception history has demonstrated the biblical texts are used to oppress and marginalize minorities, legitimize colonialism, anti-Semitism, and slavery, often these interpretations are somehow enabled by the texts themselves. Although, of course, that was never the original intention. And what you see here in the picture is, of course, a criticism of how the curse of Ham was used to legitimize slavery. So there are two things we can observe here, and that is that texts are not necessarily innocent. They can be used for good and they can be used for bad, but both readings are often enabled by the text, even if not intended by the author. So we have a distinction here between text and author. And secondly, it brings our attention to the fact that interpretations are not neutral or self-evident, even if both believers and biblical scholars sometimes like to phrase it like that. Every interpretation has practical implications. It's an authoritative text that can be used as a weapon against other human beings and have, as we all know, been and maybe still is being used like that. And that's something one has to take into account when making interpretations. At least if you're in a power position, if you're a priest or teacher. And Augustine, to finally turn to a church father, when asked how to know which reading is the best reading, actually puts this effect argument in the foreground. The interpretation that helps you increase the double love, the love for God and the love for human beings, is the best one, according to him. So he seemingly puts relation as a criteria for how you should read the Bible. And I think that's actually quite challenging. But if you go back to our first observation, the texts themselves enable a variety of interpretation. Reception history tends to focus on the interpreting subject of the text and its effect, not so much on the text itself. And we can call this the ontology of text, what a text is and how it works. And without maybe realizing it, we often have a very Platonic understanding of texts, in the sense that a text is understood as a container of meaning. Now, Brendan Breed, who is a biblical scholar, he notes that historical critical scholars often use the metaphor of a ship, which is the biblical text, and its meaning as that being anchored in the original context. And the logic is simple. To understand the Bible, we need to go back to its original setting, because that's where we find its actual or best meaning. And I find this metaphor a little bit funny somehow, for we all know that the ships weren't made to be anchored. They were made to transfer goods from one place to another so that goods can be used outside of their original context, regardless of how they were used in their original contexts. So Breed challenged us to think about text in a more non-conservative way. He says, and I read from the slide, whereas biblical criticism tend to think in terms of morality, asking, what text is the best text and what should one do with it? Or in terms of etiology, asking, what did it originally look like and what did it originally mean? From the point of view of reception history, biblical scholars can think in terms of ethology, that is, what can a biblical text do? Now, this is the last idea is a completely different way of understanding texts. Very few people would think it's interesting to study a dog, primarily in order to judge how much dog a German Shepherd is in comparison to reconstructed Urdog. Breed points out that when you study dogs, you're interested in how they adapt and develop new features depending on what context you put them in. You're also probably interested in how you can use a dog for a specific purpose. And similarly to Breed, Mira Polyak is also another important biblical scholar. She points out that the texts behave much like plants. You do not really know beforehand which stories will survive and thrive when transposed to new environments, and which ones will die out. She notes that many biblical characters are able to survive in so many different contexts and also non-religious contexts. And I quote, no differently than the literary portraits of Ulysses, Hamlet, and Lady Macbeth, those of the Bible's major dramatis persona still engage readers regardless of religious background or the question of their historicity. Now let's think about the essential feature of a text, not in terms of what it once was, but what it can do, how texts adapt and survive in new contexts, and how they can affect people. Because not all texts do survive, do they? Just some. Why are some texts canonized and others are not? What do texts do to survive? Well, to find a discussion of that, it's been time to go back to classical hermeneutics. Now, according to Gadamer, who is very much the father of modern hermeneutics, a classic work is timeless in the sense that later readers perceive it as contemporary to them. There's the so-called fusion of historical horizons going on. And this leads to the interesting conclusion, and here I quote another scholar, Gunda, who says, as Howe argues in agreement with Gadamer, what keeps classic text relevant and alive is their ability to consistently be different as they encounter different situations. So a classic, following this logic, as the Bible, classic is a classic because of its ability to be different. And that says something very interesting about the ontology of the Bible, which is quite different from how you see a text in biblical criticism. Because here biblical texts are biblical texts because people can read themselves into the text, because they can transcend the original meaning. So it's precisely because they can survive outside of the original context that they are biblical texts. And that's probably the most important sentence I'll say here today, so I will say it again. It's precisely because biblical texts can survive outside of the original context that they are biblical texts. If that is part of the essence of a text, how can we not focus on their reception where this quality appears? So what I'm basically saying here is that biblical criticism is only able to answer part of what a biblical text is. Reception is needed to provide a full picture of that text. And that's why reception is not something which should just be mentioned, but something which should be given equal attention to biblical criticism, in my opinion. Now, finally, as this is a presentation within Eastern Christian Studies, I should at least mention one Greek church father, so I choose Athanasius. And this is from Athanasius' letter where he's discussing Psalms. And he says, Psalms serve as a mirror wherein the reader sees himself and his own soul. Hearing how God helps those who hope and trust in him, the listener too rejoices and begins to render thanks, as though that gracious help already were his own. It is not as though someone else were being persecuted, but out of his own experience that he renders praise to God. The movement of our own souls are reflected in the Psalms, and the words are indeed our very own, given us to serve both as a reminder of our changes of condition and as a pattern and model for the amendment of our lives. So what Athanasius says here is very much, I think, in line with Gadamer's definition of the classic. The Psalms are timeless because you can read yourself into them. And it's very much also reflecting what text can do, what power text can have over people if you allow them to. Athanasius is basically saying that the Psalms are phrasing your experience for you so that your experience makes sense to you and so that you can analyze and handle your experience even before you have fully experienced it. And I think this identification aspect is very much in line with how people in general experience the reading of the Bible or any good texts that we really like. So why should not this aspect of the Bible be subjected to study as well? Why don't we study what texts do as fervently as we study what text originally meant? So with this short presentation, I hope I've been able to demonstrate how complex but fascinating the relations between text and reader and context really is. I know I haven't said much about the church, but the church tradition, as I see it, can be understood as the context or the structure which gives the text its form and deliver it in a certain way to the reader. But I would like to see all these three parts as agents. They're all parts of making a text mean a certain thing, and they should therefore be studied independently, but also in juxtaposition to one another. So that's basically what I had to say. I could also say that if you're interested in learning more about this, I can recommend these books, which I use very much now. Reception, History and Biblical Studies, Theory and Practice, has very interesting articles on theory and reception theory. And this Narratology, Hermeneutics and Midrash book is also, I think, very interesting in when you're looking at the close connection between the early interpretations and those interpretations taking place already within the biblical texts. So they include both Jewish and Christian material. And also the last book there, I just found it online. I haven't read it yet. Well, I have an article in it, which I read, but it's open. It's open access, so you can just download it. And if you're interested to see how one single motive in the biblical texts has sort of, I mean, the meaning of that has changed from its early biblical times to, I think they're going up already all the way up to the modern era. And then also Mira Polyak's article here in Biblia Arabica site. If you go there, you can find out more about how the Bible has been used in this blog, very much in the Judeo-Arabic communities, but there are all sorts of blogs blog posts at that site. And we also use these books in our education, at least on the advanced levels. So yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.